Seeing as it's week 5, we're about halfway through the course. I think it might be valuable because we are going to transition next week strongly into Christology. Not that we'll leave Trinitarianism behind, but that we're going to do other things to kind of reflect on how the doctrine of God has evolved and moved. Because, for the first, 1,800 years of Christian theology, especially after the Reformation and really the dominance of Western culture in the world, Latin Christianity, the Christianity that came out of Athens and not just Jerusalem, really dominated. And classical theism was a huge result from that. And beautiful theology done, incredible stuff that we still want to affirm. But we have seen over the last about 200 years, and especially in the last 100 years, there's been a lot of critiques about what we mean when we say God is omnipotent or omniscient. That the classical attributes of God, we want to affirm them, but we also want to go further than that. We want to take into account human experience. We want to take into account, especially now, Trinitarianism and pneumatology. And so I would say in the first half, maybe first 70% of the 20th century was kind of this massive reappropriation of Trinitarian thinking, a reemergence of the Spirit as an actual co-equal member of the Trinity, and the implications that had for theology. And then right around the 1960s, 1970s, another thing sort of burst forth on kind of the Western theological scene, and that was the recognition of located readings of theology. The notion that, your experience and your life matter, and what is possible to say about God is different for different people with different backgrounds. And insofar as, white male Europeans and North Americans had kind of come to dominate the classical discussions of the nature of God, well, feminist and liberation theologies kind of burst on the scene. And I would say in the latter half of the 20th century, and now in the first half of the 21st century, theology is going through another massive change where not only are we going to be Trinitarian, not only are we going to be faithful to the classical tradition, not only are we going to re-embrace pneumatology, we're also going to incorporate real lived human experience in the way that we think reflectively about who God is and what God's like. And it might be that the stories and the locations of one group of people are dramatically important and need to be heard for us to have something that's closer to the truth about God. And I think that right now we're in this zone where traditionally, historically marginalized communities are for the first time developing constructive, creative theological expressions and proposals, which is awesome. And I think that we're going to see in the 21st century is probably really going to be the century in which there's fidelity to the classical Orthodox tradition, and yet there's a proliferation of creative proposals that I think are already having purchase. And it's a legitimate enterprise to try to reckon God from my space, from my location. Yeah, in conjunction with classical theology, in conjunction with the scriptures, of course. But to say classical theology misses something when it doesn't take into account this, and people like me see this in a way that most people wouldn't. And I think that we'll look back, well, we won't, we'll be gone, unless the scientists manage to make us live forever, which is possible, I guess. We're going to look back and we're going to say that, everything from a theology of disability to green theology, eco-theology, feminist theology, that all these different voices are going to start to shape and reappropriate the tradition in some surprising ways, but also I think in some very orthodox ways. And I think that probably the task for theologians right now is to, recognize your own location, as they say, check your privilege, and be open right now. I don't know that right now is necessarily the moment where we need to critique everything. Right now, I think there's value in just hearing different construals of who God is. Of course, again, in light of the tradition and in light of Scripture, we're not going to leave that behind, and for that matter, in light of the natural sciences. But what right now is almost like a cacophony of just massively different voices and different construals. I think the task for 21st century theology will be to begin to weave them together in ways that make sense, and that are faithful to the creedal tradition. So one of the recommended readings for this week is reading the creeds. And one thing I would recommend doing is reading them not just as this is what all Christians believe, but as sort of orienting lenses through which the world is known. Because what all Christian theology does is it reads my construal of the world through the lens of God's story. The story that reaches its climax in Jesus of Christ's death and resurrection. A story that won't be complete until the eschaton. But that's what the world's like. And whether it's Mularista or, feminist critique or, LGBTQIA plus theology or analytic theology or liberation theology, whatever it is, we approach the world from wherever we're at, our location, and then we begin to merge that with a telling of the world that says God's involved, God's redeeming, and God's got a good future ahead. And over the course, I think, of the conversations that are going to happen over the 21st century, I think maybe even into the 22nd century, I think these voices are going to become less cacophonous and become more like a chorus, right? Where there's going to be dissonance, and there's going to be assonance, and there's also going to be beautiful melody, and it's going to create something that is much bigger than anything that we can see or imagine now. And I'd like to invite you to be a part of that. So what that means then is listening in the forums, listening in your congregations. Stick to your guns, of course. Don't just be tossed aside by every wind of doctrine, as the New Testament says. But be attentive and recognize that that there are voices out there that may change and may be Spirit sent, wind of God, to tug at you and to reorient you. And maybe your voice is meant to tug and reorient someone else.